Well, happy Palm Sunday to all of you from me as well. Nice to see you all today. You know, as it's Palm Sunday, we're going to take a little break from our usual journey through Matthew's Gospel, which we're doing at the moment, to take a look at this story of the triumphal entry into Jerusalem that we just acted out with the kids. You know, this event of Jesus going into Jerusalem is what marked the beginning of what we call the Passion Week, the week leading up to when Jesus was crucified. And it's recorded in all four of our Gospels. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they record all of this. And actually, you know, in our four Gospels, the books in the Bible that tell us about Jesus' life and what he did and everything, you know, the first four chapters, or not the first four chapters, but there are four chapters that tell us about the first 30 years of Jesus' life. Okay, so there's 89 chapters altogether. And there's four that tell us about the first 30 years of his life. And then, so the remaining 85 chapters tell us about the last 3 years of his life, or at least the last 3 years before he was crucified, or while he was on earth, at least, let's put it that way. Of those 85 chapters, 29 chapters of the Gospels are focused on what we call this Passion Week. So 29 talk about the time from when Jesus came into Jerusalem on the donkey up to when he was crucified and rose again. That means that around 1/3 of what the gospel writers wrote for us about Jesus is about this week that we celebrate this week, which just shows us how significant it is in the history of the world and why it's an important one for us as Christians. And probably for most of us, we're quite familiar with this story about Jesus as he rides into Jerusalem on a donkey, and the crowds lay down the palm branches and shout, Hosanna, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. But what we might not be quite so familiar with is how this story, how this event is so full of Old Testament imagery. It's very rich, and where it kind of fits in the big picture of what God is showing us about who Jesus is. And if we go right back to the first book of the Bible, Genesis, and go to near the end of Genesis, in Genesis chapter 49, Jacob, who was forefather of Israel, he's about to die, and he's pronouncing prophetic blessings on his sons. And you can read what he says for each son. But for one of his sons, Judah, you remember he had 12 sons who become the 12 tribes of Israel. For Judah, he says this: the scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he whom it belongs shall come, and the obedience of the nations shall be his. He will tether his donkey to a vine, his colt to the choicest branch. He will wash his garments in wine, his robes in the blood of grapes. Now, this is a prophecy that Jacob was speaking about this future ruler that was going to come from the tribe of Judah. You know, Judah's line is the royal line, and the promise is that one will come from the line of Judah who will possess this scepter of authority. A scepter is this like funny stick thing that kings have that show their authority. And it says his reign will extend over all nations. And then we have this imagery of the donkey and a vine in verse 11, which is interesting because the donkey in this context represents a symbol of peace. As instead of a war horse, you go to war on a horse, but when you come in peace, you would come riding on a donkey. This ruler that's going to come from Judah is not going to come through military might, but through peaceful authority. And so if we jump forward in the story of the Bible to 1 Kings chapter 1, in 1 Kings chapter 1, we find an example of this. When Solomon becomes king of Israel, you know, it's coming towards the end of David's life. And he had promised Bathsheba that her son Solomon would be the one to reign after him. I can't remember how many sons David had, but I think it was something like 19. but so there was a little bit of testosterone going on and a little bit of jostling for that position. And one of David's sons, Adonijah, I don't know if that's the right way to say it, but Adonijah, he tried to set himself up as king instead of Solomon. And he goes off and sacrifices and with a priest and so on. But David hears about this. And so in response, he sends the prophet Nathan along with Zadok the priest to anoint Solomon as king. And once they've anointed him, they bring him into the city, into Jerusalem, riding on King David's mule, his donkey, into Jerusalem. And in this way, Solomon was able to take the throne from his father David in a peaceful and humble way. And he didn't retaliate by killing his brother, which would have been a typical response, but he let his brother live and forgave him, and in this way, Solomon becomes the peaceful king of Israel. And so the question that we should be asking ourselves, based on what Judah has been prophesied, what Jacob has prophesied of Judah, is that is Solomon the one? Is Solomon the one that's coming through the line of Judah to be this messianic figure, this messianic king that the prophecy was talking about? Well, while it looks good for Solomon at first, Solomon was blessed with wisdom. He was really wise. God used him mightily. He grew the kingdom of Israel to the biggest and most affluent and most prosperous it has been. But it isn't long before he fails to keep his heart pointed at Yahweh. In fact, it's his wives that lead him astray. And he very famously had 700 wives plus. So he was led astray. His heart, his wives came. What Solomon did is he made pacts with other nations. And as part of making these treaties and so on, he would take a wife from their people and stuff like that. And he would ended up with a lot of wives, and his wives worshipped foreign gods, and his wives turned his heart away from Yahweh. But then if we jump forward again to the time in Israel, well, the time after after Solomon, under his son, the kingdom split. And you ended up having the northern kingdom, which they called Israel, and the southern kingdom called Judah. And both of them deserted Yahweh. And eventually Israel goes off into captivity, taken by Assyria, and Judah gets conquered by the Babylonians, and they go off into captivity. But then slowly, like the prophets are still saying that God's going to restore, he's going to do it. And they go back to Jerusalem from Babylon, and they begin to rebuild. And the situation is at this point is that they've laid the foundation of the temple again to rebuild. And the foundation has been laid, but then because of the opposition, not much has happened after that. And the people were getting discouraged and wondering what God was doing. And so God sends them a prophet, the prophet Zechariah. And this is one of the things that he says to Jerusalem at that time. And we read it at the beginning of our service. That rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. You see, it wasn't Solomon and his failures. That wasn't it. The Messiah is still coming. And so we see when Jesus entered Jerusalem on the donkey in the Gospels, we realize that this is direct fulfillment of the storyline of the prophecies and the pictures from the Old Testament that have gone before. Jesus is the king from the tribe of Judah. He's declaring that the long-awaited ruler will reign and will bring peace to the world. And just as Solomon rode in on a mule, a donkey, to declare his kingship, Jesus rides into Jerusalem to declare that he is the true king, the rightful heir of the throne of David. And as Zechariah declared in his prophecy, he is a king who is righteous and victorious, but he comes lowly and gentle, riding on a donkey, not on a war horse. And this contrasted with the expectation that the Jews had at the time. The Jews were waiting for the Messiah. They knew the prophecies, but they were hoping for a political, a military Messiah who was going to overthrow the Romans who had conquered them and were oppressing them. But Jesus comes not wielding power as the world understands power, but he comes to bring salvation through his sacrificial love. And the crowds that were there waving their palm branches and shouting, Hosanna, while Jesus was entering into Jerusalem, they were unknowingly welcoming the King of Peace, even as they misunderstood the nature of his kingdom. And so we see that Jesus is fulfilling these Old Testament pictures and prophecies, but it goes even deeper than that. It's an even deeper story that goes all the way back to the beginning of time, because this is also a central part of the story of God's restoration of the whole of creation and the fulfillment of the role of what we call the second Adam or the last Adam. You see, through Jesus, we see a king who fulfills the role that Adam was supposed to fulfill in the Garden of Eden, a king who represents humanity and brings peace and brings order to creation. In the New Testament, in a couple of places, in the book of Romans, chapter 5, and in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul was presenting Jesus as the second Adam or the last Adam who came to do what the first Adam could not, to restore the order of creation and to reconcile. That just means to bring back humanity to God. Now, Adam, as the first representative of humanity, he was given dominion over creation in Genesis 1. He was given the role to oversee and to take care and to look after it and cause it to flourish. But he failed in his role because of sin. The sin that they committed resulted in the fall of humanity and the corruption of creation. But Jesus, as the second Adam, comes to fulfill this original mandate, this original destiny, this original function of Adam. And the difference is that where Adam failed, Jesus succeeds. And when we see Jesus entering Jerusalem as the king who will bring peace to the world, we're seeing the culmination, the coming together of God's original plan for creation. Just as Adam was to steward, to take care of the world, and to bring God's rule, so too does Jesus, but in a way that restores that was lost through sin. And Jesus' kingship is not just about ruling over people, it's about restoring creation to how it was intended to be, its intended glory and order. He is the true and final Adam, the one who will fulfill God's purpose for humanity and creation. And so King Solomon was also an Adam figure, or an Adamic figure, you can say. You remember that he was the one that built the first temple in Jerusalem. He was the first person to bring a dwelling place for God amongst his people. And the imagery that we see in the temple is deeply connected to the Garden of Eden. And of course, the Garden of Eden was the original dwelling place of God with man, right? With humanity. The garden was a place where humanity was to enjoy the presence of God and to steward his creation. It was a place where God would come down and walk with Adam and Eve during the cool of the day. And the temple that Solomon built with its beauty, its gold, its trees, its cherubim, it was meant to reflect Eden. It was meant, people were meant to think back to Eden when they were there, a place where heaven and earth meet. And Solomon, of course, was known for his wisdom which was a gift directly from God. Solomon's wisdom surpassed all the wisdom of the ancient world. And it was said that his reign brought peace to Israel. He brought peace. But as we already said, Solomon's wisdom, although magnificent, did not last. And his later years were marred by idolatry and disobedience. And as I said, it eventually led to the kingdom being ripped apart. And Solomon, like Adam, he couldn't fulfill the ultimate purpose. He was a shadow. He was a picture pointing forward to what was still to come, to Jesus, the Son of David. And the New Testament tells us that Jesus is the true wisdom, and he fulfills the roles that Solomon could not. And in Matthew chapter 12, in verse 42, Jesus himself declares, the Queen of the South, the Queen of Sheba, came to visit Solomon. And Jesus says in Matthew, the Queen of the South will rise at the judgment with this generation and condemn it. For she came from the ends of the earth to listen to Solomon's wisdom, and something greater than Solomon is here. Jesus, the true and final King, comes to restore not only the wisdom that Solomon had, but the order and the harmony that the Garden of Eden represented. 1 Corinthians says that he is the wisdom of God, and in his reign, all things are made right. And even all creation recognizes Jesus' kingship. In us, the story of when we read in the Bible of what happened when Jesus comes into Jerusalem. The Pharisees are upset, the religious elite, those who say, no, this is not supposed to be like this. And they come and they say to Jesus, tell your followers to stop saying this stuff. Tell them to shut up. And they rebuke Jesus, and he responds in Luke 19, verse 40, saying, I tell you, if they keep quiet, even the stones will cry out. The stones in the path, the rocks will cry out. And this just points us to this cosmic reality that the earth itself longs for the restoration that only the true King can bring. If you know the book of Romans, then you know that this echoes where it tells us there that the earth is groaning, creation is groaning, it's waiting for, in eager expectation, for the revealing of the sons of God, for its restoration. And so this statement of Jesus is not only about people praising him, but it's about the restoration of all things. The very earth, stones, and nature itself will acknowledge Jesus as King, because his reign is a cosmic reign over the whole of creation and the whole of humanity. But that's not the end of the story. When we see this story of Jesus coming into Jerusalem and we see what happened, it points us backwards to see these Old Testament pictures, but it also, we're drawn to look forward, because it's not the end of the story. Jesus died, he rose again, he was with his followers for 40 days, and then he went to heaven. And when he went to heaven, he said, I'm coming back again. I'm coming back again. And in Revelation chapter 19, verses 11 to 16, we see Jesus returning as the victorious King. It says, I saw heaven standing open, and there before me was a white horse, no donkey anymore, a white horse whose rider is called Faithful and True. With justice he judges and makes war. His eyes are like blazing fire, and on his head are many crowns. He has a name written on him that no one knows but he himself. He is dressed in a robe dipped in blood, and his name is the Word of God. On his robe and on his thigh, he has this name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. You see, this is the other side of the coin. While Jesus entered Jerusalem humbly on a donkey when he first came, when he was first incarnated. He will return in glory. This time he's not going to be riding on a donkey. He's going to be riding on that war horse, on the white horse, to establish his reign over all creation. You see, the first coming of Jesus was marked by humility, was to offer salvation through his death, through his life, death, and resurrection. But the second coming is going to be marked by judgment and the full revelation of his divine authority. This is the king who will judge and rule over all creation. And it says his robe is dipped in blood. And that reminds us of the sacrifice that he made on the cross. But it's also pointing to his complete victory over his enemies. Death will be defeated, sin will be defeated. The King of Kings and Lord of Lords is returning to establish his eternal kingdom. And then, as we move on into Revelation 21 and 22, we see the final restoration of creation, a new heaven and a new earth, where God's presence will dwell with his people forever. This is the fulfillment of what was lost in the Garden of Eden. And it's only made possible because of Jesus, because of the second Adam coming to restore all things. And the vision that we see in Revelation 21 and 22 of the new heaven and the new earth, this is the ultimate fulfillment of Jesus' reign. And we see a new Jerusalem, a new city where God dwells with his people. There's no more death, no more mourning, no more crying, no more pain. This is the fulfillment of what Jesus began in his first coming. He came humbly to bring peace, but he will return in glory to establish his eternal kingdom. And so as we reflect on this story, this Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, we don't just see a king coming into the city riding on a donkey, but we see a fulfillment of God's promises to restore creation. Because Jesus is the second Adam. He is the true Solomon, the king who brings peace and wisdom and salvation, restoration. And the palm branches, the natural imagery, the rocks crying out, they remind us that all of creation recognizes him as the king who's going to restore everything to its rightful order. He is that king from the tribe of Judah that was prophesied so long ago that was going to come. His first coming was to bring peace and salvation, and his second coming will be to judge and to reign forever. But until then, we're called to live under his kingship, bringing his peace, bringing his wisdom, bringing his justice to the world around us. So let's not just welcome our King with praise and palm branches and hosannas. Let's live under his kingship. Let's live with faithful obedience, trusting that his reign is going to bring us back to the Garden of Eden and beyond to the eternal city of God. Let's be like the crowds in Jerusalem and welcome him with open hearts and looking forward with hope to his return, all the while knowing that he is present with us right now. If you are a Christian, if you're a believer in the Lord Jesus Christ, if you've put your life into his hands, he's promised you his Spirit to be with you now, to help you and to transform you little by little from the inside out. And it says, he who has begun a good work will bring it to completion. He will do it. And so today, let's come to him, the King and the restorer of our souls, the restorer of creation. Let's have union with him that may change us from the inside out. Just as he came into Jerusalem offering peace, he comes to our hearts also offering us peace